Today's lesson is Bridge to the Past. Hi, everybody. My name is Roger.
And I'm Mike.
And today we're going to continue talking about forming a bridge to the past. We could talk about bridges because bridges are structures that you can count, so it's a countable noun. But here we're talking about maybe a bridge to the past in a more figurative sense, more of an abstract sense. Yes, indeed, if you go check out these bridges, they will kind of take you to the past. They will serve as a bridge from the present to the past.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely. And we've been enjoying a few of the bridges so far, Ponte Vecchio and Rialto Bridge. But as wonderful as these bridges are, they are inhabited. They are very old. They are still there, so you can visit them today. But they are also both in Italy. So I don't know about you, Roger. I think it's time to branch out a little bit in our search for the best inhabited bridges of old Europe. What do you say?
It's a good idea, and we'll do that right now by going to Deutschland, or Germany, and we'll talk about the Brücke there. Let's listen to the first part of our lesson and find out about that inhabited bridge in Germany.
Brücke. One of the best preserved medieval cities in Germany, Erfurt is home to the picturesque Brücke, whose name means Merchant's Bridge. The current structure, completed in 1510, was originally topped with 62 wood buildings and featured a stone church at each end. Following several rounds of redevelopment over the centuries, there are now 32 half-timber shops selling antiques and traditional crafts.
大家好，第一部分我们看到单字 antique， 这个字是名词，意思是古董或是古物。例如 This table is an antique, so please don't put anything on it. 这张桌子是个古董，所以不要把任何东西摆在上面。或是 I received all of my parents' antiques when they passed away. 我在我父母过世后，接收了他们的古董。另外，这个字也可以当作形容词，表示古老的、年代久远的或是古董的。举例来说 The store specializes in antique furnishings. 这家店专卖古董家具。或者 The writer furnished his library with an antique desk. 那位作家用一张古董桌来装饰他的图书室。接着我们看到名词 craft， 指手工艺、技艺或是手工艺品。像是 Larry bought some special art paper at a craft store. Larry 在一间手工艺品店买了一些特别的美术用纸。或是 Sheila learned the craft of pottery making from her grandmother. Sheila 从祖母那里学到制作陶器的工艺。另外，这个字也可以当作动词，意思是精心制作或是手工制作。我们可以说The speechwriter crafted a statement for the president to deliver at his press conference. 演说拟稿人替总统精心撰写要在记者会上发表的声明稿。也可以说 Richard crafts many household items by hand in his workshop. Richard 在他的工作室亲手制作许多家用品。
Okay, so as promised, we're going to talk about the first part of our lesson today. And the first part is about a bridge in Germany called Brücke. Now, one of the best preserved medieval cities in Germany, Erfurt, is home to the picturesque Brücke, whose name means Merchant's Bridge. So if something's home to, that means this particular thing is there. Taipei is home to Taipei 101, a very iconic structure in northern Taiwan.
Absolutely. And so Erfurt is home to a picturesque bridge called Brücke. If something is picturesque, well, it basically means you want to bring your camera because it's worth a picture. It's the kind of thing a painter would paint or a photographer would take a picture of, and certainly as a tourist, you would want to get a good shot of that. It's so beautiful, it's so lovely. Take a picture, it's so picturesque. Now let's find out more about it. The current structure, the one you would see today if you visited funded right now. The current structure, completed in 1510, so 500 or so years ago, was originally topped with 62 wood buildings and featured a stone church at each end. Wow, this must be quite a large bridge, or those buildings must have been very small because there were 62 of them on this bridge, and it featured a stone church at each end. So at each end of the bridge, where the bridge meets the land or the riverbank, that's where you would have found an old stone church. 2 of them, in fact, back when the bridge was built. Following several rounds of redevelopment over the centuries, there are now 32 half-timber shops selling antiques and traditional crafts. So that's kind of cool. Even though it's 500 years later, the bridge still deserves its name as the Merchants Bridge or the Kammerbrücke because they still have merchants on it selling things. That's what merchants do. Timber is basically wood that's cut down and shaped from a tree. When you cut a log into a nice long square piece of wood, that might be a piece of timber. And we use timber to build the frames and structures of buildings. So this is basically a half wooden, probably half stone building. So they have these 32 half timber shops and they're still selling things. These days, though, they're selling antiques and traditional crafts. What are antiques? Antiques are kind of old household items that are valued because of their age and their beauty and the fact that they've survived so long. They might look a little old, they might have a bit of damage on them, but if you have a 100-year-old table from an old farmhouse or something like that, people would value that greatly for decorating no matter where they are. It's the kind of thing people would spend a little bit money for. So if you take care of your furniture, in 50 or 100 years, you can sell it for twice the price and call it an antique, because that's what it is, old furniture that's highly valued. And also traditional crafts, so it's not just old stuff, it's new stuff, but this stuff is made by hand by folk artists and things like that, crafts people. When we talk about crafts, we talk about things made by hand and not made by a machine in a factory. So both of these things sound great and also worthy souvenirs from your visit to the Kammerbrücke.
Okay, so there we go with Germany in Europe there. And now we're going to go to Eastern Europe and talk about the covered bridge in Lovech, Bulgaria. Let's listen.
Covered bridge. The covered bridge connecting the old and new towns in Lovech, Bulgaria, is probably the city's most iconic site. It has undergone a number of changes over time thanks to chance occurrences, including a flood that destroyed most of it in 1872. Officials hired an architect to reconstruct the bridge, and locals pitched in to help. Sadly, their efforts didn't last long, as the new one burned down in 1925. The existing bridge, which was finished in 1982, is a copy of the one lost in the fire, and it allows visitors to get a feel for the 19th century version to this day.
"第二部分我们看到单字 occurrence， 这个字是名词，指事件发生的事情或是发生出现。例如 My cat begging to be let outside at 3 a.m. has unfortunately become a daily occurrence. 我的猫半夜3点就要出去放风一事，已不幸地成为每日常态。或是 Forest fires are occurrences that happen each year in this dry region. 在此干燥的区域，森林大火为每年发生的事。另外补充 occurrence 的动词 occur, O-C-C-U-R, occur 指发生或是出现，像是 A serious car accident occurred on the street in front of Bob's school. Bob 学校前面的街上发生严重车祸。也可以说 Many changes have occurred in the entertainment industry over the last decade. 过去10年来，娱乐产业有许多的改变。最后我们看到动词 reconstruct 指重建或是改建。例如Investigators reconstructed the events leading up to the crime. 调查人员还原导致这起犯罪的事件。
Okay, so again, we're going to talk about the covered bridge in Lovech, Bulgaria, which again is a country in Eastern Europe. And of course, there are lots of lovely countries in Eastern Europe, including Bulgaria. And if you've gone to the capital, Sofia, well, you're ready to branch out and check out some other place, and you're probably going to go to the town of Lovech and check out the covered bridge there.
That's right. You would definitely want to check out the covered bridge of Lovech, Bulgaria, because, as the article says, it's the city's most iconic site. If something is an icon, it's something that's held up for the generations, is a great example of something. It's special, it's wonderful, it's very, very unique. The Eiffel Tower is an iconic building. The Champs-Élysées is an iconic street in Paris, things like that. So if we talk about something being an icon, we can use that adjective iconic. It's definitely something that anyone who has been to Lovech would see, and anyone who's been there before would ask you, did you see the covered bridge? And of course you'd have to say yes, because it's the most famous, most well-known, most iconic thing in the town of Lovech, Bulgaria. Let's learn about it. The bridge, has undergone a number of changes over time thanks to chance occurrences, including a flood that destroyed most of it in 1872. So that's kind of interesting. The bridge has changed over time, or has undergone a number of changes. When you undergo something, basically something happens to you. Some force is exacted upon you. Some experience is, lived through by you. You might undergo surgery. If you have a serious medical condition, you might undergo a life-changing experience if you nearly die in a plane crash or something. So this is sort of like an outside force, something that happens to you, and there's probably a change or some kind of evolution that happens after you undergo something like that. Could be something really small, like that's the past tense, I underwent a minor operation at my dentist's office and they removed one of my teeth.
Oh no, that must be very painful.
It is very, very painful. Not an occurrence I want to repeat.
Yeah, especially root canal procedures. I've had several of those. I underwent several dental procedures, for example, there. So again, undergo, underwent, and undergone. That's the past participle. So again, this city has undergone lots of changes over the centuries, and that's because of, or thanks to, chance occurrences. If something's chance, of course, it happens at random. You can't control it. So you've got these things that happen, an occurrence like a flood, like a typhoon, like an earthquake, etc. In this particular case, one of these occurrences was a flood, which means there's a lot of water coming up from the river, and that flood destroyed most of this bridge in the year 1872. Oh, how tragic. Now, officials hired an architect to reconstruct the bridge, and locals pitched in to help. So we've got officials, people who work for the government in this town in Bulgaria, and they didn't really know much about bridges there, so they had to hire a specialist. They had to hire an architect. An architect, of course, is somebody who designs buildings or they design structures, and so they hired this architect who would reconstruct the bridge. They would build the bridge again just like it was before. And then the local people thought, yeah, we want to have a new bridge. We want to have things the way they were before. We want to attract tourists. So they all pitched in. They all worked together to help.
That's right. And it seems that they did help and they did succeed in fixing their bridge after this terrible flood. But it didn't last too long. Sadly, it says there, that's the villagers' efforts. Their efforts didn't last long. As we read, the new one burned down in 1925. Oh no. So that new bridge that they all fixed together only lasted a little more than 50 years. There was a fire. Of course, if a fire, it catches in a building or lights a building on fire, eventually, if the fire rages out of control, the building will be burned down, destroyed by fire, as a building is. And that happened in 1925. So what did they do then? Well, the existing bridge, that's the one we would see today if we visited in the year 2022. The existing bridge, which was finished in 1982, is a copy of the one lost in the fire, and it allows visitors to get a feel for the 19th century version to this day. So there is a new bridge. It's a copy of the one lost in the fire, or the one that burned down in 1925. So it allows visitors to get a feel for the 19th century version. If you get a feel for something, it's kind of like you get a taste for something. It's not really the old bridge. Yes, the wood or whatever in the bridge is only a little more than 40 years old or something like that. But it gives you a taste. It gives you an idea, a good sense of what the 19th century version of the bridge looked like. A version is basically one form of something that probably came along over many years or changed over time, and there were different forms of it, different versions of it. When we talk about iPhone 12 versus an iPhone 6, for example, those are different versions. So the phone is basically the same, but the things that come with it, the way it looks, things like that do change as the versions develop. So this version is a newer version than the older one, but both versions look very similar. So that's nice for the tourists who want to visit Łódź.
Indeed. It's not the original, of course, but hey, you might be able to get a feel for times in the past when the original covered bridge was still standing before the fire and the flood. Okay, that brings us to the end of this part of our lesson. Let's wrap things up now with the final part. It does bring our article to a close, so let's listen to it.
Inhabited bridges are just one small part of Europe's complex history, but they provide a unique view into the past. And with space in cities becoming increasingly hard to come by, perhaps they will become a major part of its future too.
Okay, so again, the subject for today's lesson and yesterday's lesson was, or is, inhabited bridges, and they are just one small part of Europe's complex history, but they provide a unique view into the past. So there are lots of ways to get a sense of history when you travel to Europe. Of course, you've got those cobblestone streets and those old towns with their old buildings and those castles and other structures like that. But hey, the bridges are pretty cool too, especially those inhabited bridges, and they're just one small part of the complex history of Europe. You could spend years and years studying the history of Europe, but still, they provide a special or unique view into the past. Check it out.
That's right. And with space in cities becoming increasingly hard to come by, perhaps they will become a major part of its future too. So as we've sort of learned in this article over the last couple of days, these bridges served a really important purpose. Back in old Europe, they allowed people to live within the town walls without taking up extra space. Building homes on bridges made sense. And they kind of make sense today because, as that sentence says, space in cities is becoming increasingly hard to come by, to find. When we talk about to come by here, we're saying to find. A parking place downtown on a Saturday afternoon will be hard to come by. It will be hard to find, hard for us to, come across or to lock onto or something like that. So yeah, space in cities is becoming very hard to come by. It's becoming very expensive, very hard to find. Few people can afford to live in city centers, so maybe we should be building on bridges. So not only will the bridges serve the purpose of transportation across the city, but also will give people a new location to live by. How about you, Roger? Would you like to live on top of a bridge?
Yeah, over the Danshui, or maybe on a bridge in various smaller towns in Taiwan. I think there's a bridge like that in Sanxia.
Okay.
I think there are people selling things on that bridge, but I'm not sure I would call that an inhabited bridge, but it's still pretty cool, and it's an interesting topic to discuss amongst your classmates. Okay, that brings us to the end of our explanation for today. Let's take some time now to listen to our Chinese teacher.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny， 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第二部分介绍了廊桥 Covered Bridge， 这个段落的第二句就写到说 It has undergone a number of changes over time thanks to chance occurrences. 由于偶发事件，它随着时间经历过许多变化。那文中用到片语介系词 thanks to 表达由于、因为，那它还有幸亏的意思。之后是要接名词或动名词。其实 thanks to 的意思跟 because of 接近，不过 thanks to 常用在正面的原因，可以表达幸亏怎么样、多亏怎么样那种语义。 举例来说 We had no trouble finding the place thanks to Google Maps. 幸亏有 Google 地图，我们轻轻松松就找到那个地方了，没有碰到任何困难。好，另外 thanks to 有时候也会用反讽的语气来表达归咎的原因哦。像 Thanks to you, we now have to do it all over again. 因为你，我们现在又必须重来一遍了啦，都是你啦。好，那我们再看到文中用到补充单字 occurrence， 它当可数名词表示事件发生的事情，那么当不可数名词可以表达发生出现的意思。occurrence 是来自动词 occur， 我们就来学习它的字首字根。好，看到字根 cour 或是 cur， 这样的字根呢是表达跑、流动或是运转。那么其他拼法还有 cours 或者是 curr 或者是 curs。那么在 occur 这个字当中，它的字首 oc 是来自 ob。OB 在 C 之前，它拼成了 OC， 那这个字首呢表示朝向，而字根 CUR 表示跑。当有事情发生的时候，就好像这个事情好像自己跑来找我们，朝向我们过来，所以我们用这样去想说 occur 它有那种发生出现的意思。好，顺便补充几个这一类字根的单字哦。第一个是 concur。CONCUR 它的字首 CON 表示一起，那么字根 CUR 表示运转，合在一起 concur 它具有同时发生，或者是可以表达同意、赞成或是意见一致的意思，而这是比较正式的用字。它的名词呢是重复字尾 R 再加 ENCE 变成 concurrence， 那表示赞同、同意或是同时发生。第二个补充的是 excursion， 它的字首 EX 表示向外，那么字根 CUR 表示跑， SION 是名词字尾，向外跑、往外跑，应该很容易联想到 excursion， 它有远足、短途旅行的意思。好，那第三个补充的是 curriculum， 它的字首 CURR 表示跑。好，那么 CULUM 它是拉丁文名词字尾。curriculum 这个字呢，它原本其实是有赛道的意思。同学们可以试着联想，毕业就好像赛跑的终点，我们必须把所有该上的课程上完，把这个过程跑完，才有办法毕业嘛。那用这样的方式去联想到 curriculum， 它有课程的意思咯。如果你把这个名词字尾 CULUM 改成形容词字尾 CULAR 变成 curricular， 那是形容课程的，然后在 curricular 前面加上字首 extra 是额外的嘛，合在一起 extracurricular 就是形容课外的。好，以上是今天重点整理，我们来回顾今天单字吧。
Antique. The value of antiques usually depends on their condition. Craft. My mother imports crafts from South Africa and sells them in her shop. Undergo. Vince underwent hours of training to become a lifeguard. Architect. Good architects work closely with their clients to create the perfect home. Reconstruct. The building was damaged in the war and had to be reconstructed. Version. This isn't the final version, so feel free to suggest improvements.
Discussion Starter starts now!
It's time now for our discussion starter, and here's our question. What are some potential benefits and drawbacks of inhabited bridges? Why do you think people stopped building these bridges?
That's a good question. Well, inhabited bridges do provide extra living space for people in crowded city centers, but they do take up a lot of space. So I think we stopped building these bridges because as bridges became more about transportation and had to be built big enough for cars, but also be built far enough above the water, for example, that boats could still pass along the river, I think just having the buildings there, well, the whole thing would have become too big, so the buildings got crowded out as we made bridges friendlier for cars, trucks, and trains, and also for river traffic below. But who knows? We could build bigger bridges with more buildings on them. I think that's a possible future.
You bet, Mike. But for me, inhabited bridges offer many benefits, such as an opportunity to buy and sell things or maybe entertain people with street performers and stuff like that. But of course, there are some drawbacks. Of course, bridges nowadays are used for motorized traffic. If you try to do that stuff on bridges nowadays, you're going to get run over and squashed like a cockroach. So you don't want that to happen. So that's probably why people stopped building those bridges, because they didn't want to get killed.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Mike.
I am Roger. See you next time.